He was the biggest star in the world. In 1957, Elvis Presley was more than a singer. He was a force of nature. He had 14 straight gold records. He made movies, he made millions. He also made people angry. His sneer, his hips, the raw energy of his rock and roll. It was a rebellion. Then, on December 20th, 1957, he got a piece of mail. A draft notice from the U.S. Army. For the next 2 years, he was gone. He served in Germany. When he came back in 1960, something was different. The rebellion was gone. The leather jacket was replaced with a tuxedo. The rock and roll was replaced with ballads and movie soundtracks. The next 8 years were spent in Hollywood making 3 movies a year. He didn't perform a live concert for almost a decade. What happened over there? What happened in those barracks in Friedberg, Germany? What deals were made while he was away? How did the most dangerous man in music become a safe, family-friendly movie star? The official story is simple. He did his duty. He served his country. He came home a man. But the truth is never that simple. The years from 1958 to 1960 are a black box in the middle of his career. And the years that followed, the Hollywood years, are a direct result of what happened inside that box. You know, we know the facts, we have the dates, we have the pictures of him in his uniform, but we don't have the answers. Not the real ones. These are the mysteries of the years Elvis was lost. Number 16, could a single phone call have changed everything? Before Elvis Presley was Private Presley, he was an entertainer. That was his job. It made sense that he would continue that job in the Army. The Army Special Services branch existed for that exact reason. Their job was to entertain the troops, to boost morale. It was a perfect fit, and the Army wanted him badly. In early 1958, a group of entertainers, including actor William Mickey Rooney Jr. and a Pentagon promoter named Tom Parker, no relation to the colonel, flew to Memphis. They had a proposal. They wanted Elvis to form a small musical group. He would tour military bases around the world. He would be the face of Army recruitment. He would get to do what he did best. He would play music. He would stay connected to his audience. He would avoid the mud, the drills, the mind-numbing routine of a regular GI. The offer was incredible. It was a lifeline. Elvis was reportedly excited. His band, Scotty Moore and Bill Black, were excited. It meant they could keep playing. It meant the magic wouldn't stop, but the decision wasn't Elvis's to make. It belonged to his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. The colonel heard the offer. He listened patiently, and then he said no. His public reason was brilliant PR. The colonel said Elvis Presley did not want special treatment. He wanted to be a regular soldier. He wanted to serve his country just like any other boy from Memphis. It was a patriotic, humble story. The newspapers loved it. It transformed Elvis from a rebellious teen idol into an American hero overnight. It took the edge off his dangerous image. It made parents, the ones who hated his swiveling hips, suddenly respect him. It was a masterstroke of public relations, but was that the real reason? Many people close to the situation, including members of his own entourage, believed something else was going on. The colonel's real reason was control. If Elvis was in special services, he would be performing. He would be creating new music. He would be in the public eye, managed by the U.S. Army. The colonel would lose his grip, but if Elvis was a regular soldier, isolated in Germany, he was completely dependent on the colonel. Parker could control the flow of information. He could control the money. He could spend 2 years repackaging the Elvis brand without any new, unpredictable input from Elvis himself. There's another darker theory. It's the one Peter Guralnick explores in his definitive biography, Last Train to Memphis. Colonel Tom Parker was not who he said he was. He wasn't Tom Parker. He wasn't an American citizen. He was born Andreas Cornelis van Kuijk in the Netherlands. He was an illegal immigrant. To travel overseas with Elvis on a special services tour, the colonel would have needed a passport. Applying for a passport would have exposed his entire life as a fraud. He would have faced deportation or worse. So he couldn't leave the country, and if he couldn't go with Elvis, he wouldn't let Elvis go. It was that simple. He chose to protect his own secret rather than protect his client's career and artistic soul. So Elvis went to Fort Hood for basic training. He learned to shoot a rifle. He learned to drive a tank. And the world's greatest entertainer didn't entertain anyone for 2 years. That one phone call, that one no from the Colonel set the course for everything that came after. It established a pattern. The Colonel would always choose the safe, profitable, controllable path over the artistic, risky, or passionate one. This decision led directly to the Hollywood years, the safe movie contracts, the formulaic songs, the creative prison Elvis found himself in for most of the 1960s. It all started here, with one decision. What was Colonel Parker really thinking when he turned down the Special Services offer? Was it a calculated business move, a way to rebrand Elvis as a patriot, or was it an act of pure self-preservation, a desperate attempt to hide his own illegal status? Did Elvis ever truly understand what that decision cost him, or did he buy the Colonel's story about being a regular GI? What would rock and roll history look like if Elvis had spent 2 years touring the world with a guitar instead of a gun? Number 15, why did his entire sound change? Listen to Jailhouse Rock, recorded in 1957. It's raw, it's dangerous, the drums hit hard. Elvis's voice snarls. It's the sound of a rebellion. Now listen to It's Now or Never, recorded in 1960, right after he got out of the army. It's an epic ballad. It's based on the Italian opera song O Sol Mio. It's polished, dramatic, and soaring. His voice is technically brilliant, maybe better than ever, but the danger is gone. The raw edge has been smoothed away. It was a massive hit, one of his biggest ever. But it was a different kind of Elvis. The army years are the great dividing line in his music. Before the army, he was the king of rock and roll. After the army, he became a pop vocalist. He recorded rock songs, of course, but his focus shifted. The sound became bigger, more orchestral. The production became cleaner. The rebellion was replaced by professionalism. The question is why? How did 2 years of military service completely reshape the sound of the most influential musician of the 20th century? Part of the answer is musical evolution. In Germany, Elvis was exposed to a wider range of music. He listened to opera, he listened to the grand European ballads, he was a musical sponge, and he absorbed everything. He spent countless hours in his rented house in Bad Nauheim playing piano and singing. He wasn't just listening to rock and roll anymore, he was maturing as a vocalist. He wanted to prove he could do more than just sneer and shout. He wanted to be a great singer in the tradition of Dean Martin or Frank Sinatra. When he came back, he had the vocal power to pull it off. The Colonel also played a huge role. Rock and roll was seen as a teenage fad. Many people, including the Colonel, thought it wouldn't last. Ballads and pop songs had a broader appeal. They appealed to adults, they appealed to the whole family. The Colonel wanted to move Elvis out of the teenage market and into the mainstream Las Vegas and Hollywood market. A softer, more sophisticated sound was essential for that transition. The Colonel didn't care about art. He cared about demographics. He cared about selling records to the largest possible audience. The new sound was good for business. The technology of recording was also changing. In the 1950s, recording was a raw, live process. The Sun Records sessions were basically live in the studio recordings. By the early 1960s, studios like RCA's Studio B in Nashville had become much more sophisticated. They were using multi-track recording. They could add strings, backing vocals, and layers of instruments. The sound became bigger and more produced because the technology allowed it to. Elvis, along with his producers, Chet Atkins and Steve Sholes, embraced this new technology. But there's a deeper, more personal reason. The man himself had changed. The boy who recorded Heartbreak Hotel was gone. The death of his mother, the discipline of the army, the isolation of being in a foreign country, it all took a toll. The wild energy of his youth was tempered by loss and experience. He came back more serious, more guarded. His music reflected that. The raw, uninhibited joy of the early songs was replaced by a more controlled, professional performance. He was no longer a kid discovering his power. He was a superstar conscious of his image and his career. The change in his music wasn't just a business decision. It was the sound of a man who had been fundamentally altered by his time away. Did Elvis consciously decide to abandon his rock and roll roots, or was he pushed into a new style by his manager and his record label? Was the new, polished sound a sign of musical maturity, or was it the first step in selling out his artistic integrity? If he had stayed a raw rock and roller, could his career have even survived the 1960s? Or was this change the only reason he remained a star? Number 14, what really happened to the Memphis Mafia? When Elvis went to Germany, he didn't go alone. He was allowed to bring some family and friends to live with him off base. His father, Vernon, and his grandmother, Minnie May, came along, and so did a few of his closest friends, the core of what would become known as the Memphis Mafia. Guys like Lamar Fique and Red West, they were his buddies, his bodyguards, his support system. They lived with him in a rented house at Goethstrasse 14 in Bad Nauheim. Their job was to keep Elvis company, to protect him from the outside world, to keep things normal, but things weren't normal. They were in a foreign country. Elvis was a sergeant in the U.S. Army. He had duties on the base. And the guys were left to their own devices for long stretches of time. They were young men with a lot of money and a lot of time on their hands. And this is where the story gets murky. The official narrative is one of camaraderie. They played touch football, they went to the movies, they hosted parties, they were a band of brothers looking after their friend. The unofficial story is a lot darker. It involves boredom, jealousy, and a dangerous new habit. The boredom was constant. They were thousands of miles from home with no real purpose other than to be there for Elvis when he got off duty. To kill the time, they engaged in all sorts of pranks and wild behavior. According to many accounts, including Joe Esposito's book Good Rockin' Tonight, the house was often a chaotic mess of wrestling matches, food fights, and practical jokes. But the most significant thing that happened in that house in Germany was the introduction of drugs. Not illegal street drugs, but prescription pills, amphetamines. Elvis and the guys were introduced to them by a German sergeant. The purpose was practical. The pills helped them stay awake on late-night military maneuvers. They provided energy, they were readily available, and at the time not considered particularly dangerous. They were just a tool to get the job done. This is where the story of Elvis's lifelong struggle with prescription drugs begins. It's in Germany, in that house. With his friends, Lamar Fique, one of the original members, spoke openly in later years about how prevalent the pill use became. It started as a way to stay awake, but it quickly became a way to manage moods. It was uppers to get going, downers to go to sleep. It was a vicious cycle. And it wasn't just Elvis. You know, the guys around him were doing it too. It became part of the culture of the group. This period also solidified the strange power dynamic of the Memphis Mafia. They were his friends, but they were also his employees. Their livelihood depended on him. This created a strange mix of genuine friendship and sycophancy that had to keep him happy. And if what made him happy was late-night parties fueled by pills, who was going to say no? This was the beginning of the bubble that would surround Elvis for the rest of his life. A world where no one ever told him no. A world where his every whim was catered to. That bubble was built in Bad Nauheim. The time in Germany forged the Memphis Mafia into the unit they would become. It bonded them together, but it also introduced the elements that would contribute to their, and Elvis's, downfall. The isolation from the real world, the dependence on Elvis for everything, and the pills. It all started there. Were the Memphis Mafia, his friends, or his enablers? Did their presence in Germany protect him, or did it create the isolated bubble that would eventually suffocate him? Was the introduction to amphetamines an innocent accident of military life, or was it the moment the fuse was lit on his self-destruction? How different would his life have been if he had faced the army alone, without his entourage? Number 13, was Priscilla Beaulieu a romance or a project? In September 1959, a friend of Elvis's named Curry Grant brought a guest to a party at the house on Goethstrasse. She was the 14-year-old stepdaughter of a U.S. Air Force captain. Her name was Priscilla Beaulieu, and Elvis was 24. He was the most famous man of the world. He was immediately smitten. The story, as told by both Elvis and Priscilla, is a fairy tale. He saw her as a pure, untouched symbol of everything he missed about home. He was a gentleman. He treated her with respect. They talked for hours. He played the piano for her. He saw in her a chance to mold the perfect woman. In her book, Elvis and Me, Priscilla writes that he told her, "I want a woman who can understand that I need to be able to be myself, to come home to." He wanted someone he could trust, someone who wasn't after his fame or his money. He met with her parents, Captain Paul Beaulieu, and his wife, Anne. He charmed them. He promised he would take care of her. He promised his intentions were honorable. Against their better judgment, they allowed their 14-year-old daughter to have a chaperoned and then unchaperoned relationship with the world's biggest rock and roll star. But was it a fairy tale romance or was it something more complicated? Elvis was a lonely and isolated man. He He was grieving the recent death of his mother. He was surrounded by men, by the army, by a world that was hard and disciplined. Priscilla was a link to a world of innocence he felt he had lost. He could control the relationship. He set the terms. He told her how to dress, how to wear her hair, how to do her makeup. He wanted her to be his living doll. According to people who were there, like Lamar Fike, Elvis was obsessed with her youth and purity. He put her on a pedestal. Their relationship was, by Priscilla's own account, not consummated for years, not until their wedding night. He wanted to preserve her. This wasn't a normal relationship between a man and a woman. It was a project. He was creating his ideal partner from scratch. This raises uncomfortable questions. What was a 24-year-old superstar doing with a 14-year-old girl? Even by the standards of the late 1950s, it was a significant age gap and a questionable power dynamic. He had all the power. She was a schoolgirl in a foreign country. He was Elvis Presley. When Elvis left Germany in 1960, he promised to send for her. For the next 2 years, they communicated through letters and phone calls. He was back in Hollywood, living the life of a movie star, dating his co-stars like Anne Margaret. Priscilla was in Germany waiting. Finally, in 1962, he convinced her parents to let her move to Memphis and live at Graceland. She was supposed to finish high school there. She was still a minor. She lived with his father and stepmother in a separate house on the property, but she spent most of her time with Elvis. He continued to mold her. He was her creator. The relationship that began in Germany defined the rest of his personal life. It showed his desire for control, it showed his deep-seated loneliness, and it showed his attraction to an ideal of purity that he could shape and possess. It wasn't a relationship of equals. It was the king and his ward. The seeds of their complicated and ultimately failed marriage were sown in that house in Bad Nauheim. Was Elvis genuinely in love with Priscilla, or was he in love with the idea of creating the perfect woman? Was their relationship a romantic fairy tale or a troubling example of grooming and control? How did a 14-year-old girl handle the pressure of being the secret girlfriend of the most famous man on the planet? And what does this relationship tell us about the deep-seated psychological needs of a man who seemingly had everything? Number 12. Did the army actually break his spirit? The Elvis, who went into the army in 1958, was a rebel. He was a force of nature. He was unpredictable. He was raw energy. He moved in a way that scared people. He sang in a way that broke all the rules. He was the embodiment of youth rebellion. The Elvis who came out of the army in 1960 was different. He was polished. He was polite. He called people sir. He was disciplined. He was in many ways tamed. The army prides itself on breaking down individuals and rebuilding them as part of a team. It strips you of your identity. You get a haircut, you get a uniform, you get a serial number. And Elvis's was 53,310,761. You are no longer special, you are a soldier. For a man who was the most famous individual on earth, this must have been a profound shock. He went from having his every whim catered to having to take orders, clean latrines, and go on 20-mile marches. The physical demands were intense. Basic training at Fort Hood, Texas was grueling. He was part of the 3rd Armored Division in Germany. They were on the front lines of the Cold War. They ran maneuvers in the freezing German winters. It was hard, physical work. This was not a celebrity photo op. It was real military service. This experience undoubtedly instilled a sense of discipline and respect for authority that he didn't have before. But the psychological impact may have been even greater. His entire world had been about freedom and self-expression. The army was about conformity and suppression of the individual. For 2 years, he had to bottle up the very energy that had made him a star. He had to follow the rules. He had to be a good soldier. Many people believe this experience fundamentally changed him. It broke his rebellious spirit. When he came back, he was more willing to take orders. Not just from army sergeants, but from Colonel Parker. He had learned to be a good soldier, and now he was going to be a good employee. He accepted the movie roles he was given. He recorded the songs he was told to record. The fire that had defined his early career seemed to be banked. Peter Guralnick argues in Careless Love that the army, combined with the death of his mother, forced Elvis to grow up too fast. He lost the playful, anarchic spirit of his youth. He became more serious, more introspective, and more willing to compromise. He had faced real responsibility and real loss. The world was no longer his playground. However, there's another perspective. Some argue the army didn't break him, it saved him. In 1957, his life was spinning out of control. The fame was overwhelming. He was surrounded by temptations. The army gave him a forced timeout. It gave him structure and discipline at a time when he desperately needed it. It grounded him. It allowed him to step off the superstar treadmill for 2 years. Without the army, some believe his career might have burned out much faster. The truth is likely somewhere in between. The army did instill discipline, but it may have come at the cost of his creative fire. He returned a more polished professional, but a less exciting artist. The dangerous Elvis was gone, replaced by a safe, reliable star. The very thing that made him a phenomenon was systematically drilled out of him. And he never fully got it back. Not until the 1968 comeback special when he finally rebelled again, this time against the safe image the Army and the Colonel had created for him. Did the U.S. Army successfully tame the world's biggest rebel? Was the discipline a positive force that saved him from an early burnout? Or did it crush the creative spirit that made him special? When he came home and put on the tuxedo for the Frank Sinatra show, was he proud of his new mature image, or was he playing a role he had been forced to learn? Is it possible that the lost years were not just lost to the public, but lost to Elvis himself? Number 11. What was Colonel Parker doing for 2 years? While Elvis was learning to be a soldier in Germany, Colonel Tom Parker was back in the United States, running the empire. He didn't just sit back and wait. The Colonel was a master promoter, a carnival barker at heart, and for 2 years he executed one of the most brilliant marketing campaigns in music history, selling a product that wasn't even there. His strategy was simple: keep Elvis in the public eye, even though he was thousands of miles away. The Colonel understood the concept of absence makes the heart grow fonder. He was going to make sure nobody forgot Elvis Presley. He started by stockpiling material. Before Elvis left, he had him record a huge number of songs. This gave RCA Records enough new material to release a steady stream of singles and albums while he was gone. Hits like A Big Hunk of Love and One Night were released while Elvis was in the army. They kept him on the charts. They kept him on the radio. The Colonel also controlled the media narrative with an iron fist. He carefully managed the flow of photos and news coming out of Germany. Every picture of Elvis in uniform, getting his hair cut, smiling with his army buddies, was a carefully curated piece of public relations. The message was clear: Elvis is a good, patriotic American boy. This completely neutralized the old criticism that he was a bad influence on teenagers. It was a total image makeover. He also launched a massive merchandising campaign. There were "I'm sticking with Elvis" buttons. There were special army-themed photos and memorabilia. He licensed everything. The Colonel made sure the Elvis brand was everywhere, even if the man himself was not. It was a lesson in how to maintain superstardom without the star. But the most important work the Colonel did during these 2 years was planning the future. He wasn't just thinking about Elvis's return, he was thinking about the next decade. He saw that the future wasn't in rock and roll concerts, it was in Hollywood. He spent those 2 years negotiating a new kind of movie deal for Elvis. He worked with producer Hal Wallace at Paramount Pictures and with other studios. He secured long-term multi-picture contracts that would pay Elvis a fortune. These weren't deals for 1 or 2 artistic films. These were contracts for a steady stream of formulaic musical comedies. They were low-risk, high-reward projects. They came with soundtrack albums, which meant more record sales. The Colonel created a business model. Elvis would make a movie, release a soundtrack, and then make another movie. It was an assembly line, and the Colonel built that assembly line while Elvis was in Germany. When Elvis came home in March 1960, the path was already set. He didn't have to think about what to do next. The Colonel had it all planned out. First, a high-profile TV appearance on Frank Sinatra's show, Welcome Home Elvis. This would reintroduce him to the public as a more mature, sophisticated entertainer. Then, straight to Hollywood to start making movies like Jive Blues. There was no time to get back in the studio and create a groundbreaking new album. There was no time to plan a tour. The machine was already running. The Colonel's work during the Army years was a business triumph. He kept his client famous and made him even richer. But it was an artistic disaster. He locked Elvis into a creative prison for the next 8 years. The decisions made by the Colonel alone in 1958 and 1959 dictated the entire course of Elvis's career in the 1960s. Elvis just came home and stepped onto the conveyor belt his manager had built. Was Colonel Parker a brilliant manager who successfully navigated his star through career-threatening absence? Or was he a controlling puppet master who, used those 2 years to build a cage for his client? Did he act in Elvis's best interest, or did he create a business model that served his own greed above all else? How much did Elvis even know about the deals being made in his name while he was overseas? Number 10. Why did Gladys's death break him so completely? On August 14th, 1958, while Elvis was on leave from basic training at Fort Hood, his mother, Gladys Presley, died of a heart attack in a Memphis hospital. She was only 46 years old. Elvis was granted emergency leave and flew home. The images from her funeral are devastating. He is seen collapsing in grief, crying out, "Oh God, everything I have is gone." It was the single most traumatic event of his life, and it happened during the most vulnerable period of his career. To understand why her death broke him, you have to understand their relationship. Elvis was an only child. His identical twin brother, Jesse Garon, was stillborn. He and his mother had an incredibly close, almost suffocatingly intense bond. They had their own private language. He called her baby. She was the center of his universe. He bought her Graceland. Everything he did for her. She was his biggest fan and his fiercest protector. In the whirlwind of his sudden fame, she was his only anchor. She was the one person he knew loved him for who he was, not for being Elvis Presley. Her death cut him adrift. He was only 23 years old. He was in the middle of the disorienting experience of army training. And suddenly, his anchor was gone. The people around him, like his friend George Klein, said they saw a light go out in him that day. He was never the same again. The playful, carefree boy was gone forever, replaced by a sadder, more serious man. The timing could not have been worse. Just a few weeks after her funeral, he had to ship out to Germany. He was being sent 5,000 miles away from his home, his family, and his mother's grave to a foreign country where he knew no one. He was grieving, and he had to do it in the cold, disciplined environment of the U.S. Army. He couldn't properly mourn. He had to be Sergeant Presley. Many biographers, including Guralnick, see Gladys's death as the pivotal psychological event of Elvis's life. It created a void in him that he spent the rest of his life trying to fill. He filled it with women. He filled it with friends. He filled it with food. He filled it with spiritual seeking, and he filled it with pills. His reliance on prescription drugs, which began in Germany shortly after her death, can be seen as an attempt to numb the pain of his loss. He was looking for a way to sleep, a way to escape the grief. Her death also profoundly changed his music. The raw, youthful optimism of the early songs was gone. After he returned from Germany, his music became more focused on themes of loss, loneliness, and heartache. The great ballads he recorded in the early 60s, like Are You Lonesome Tonight, are filled with a sense of melancholy that wasn't there before. He was no longer just singing the words. He had lived them. The loss of his mother is the ghost that haunts the Los years. It's the personal tragedy that underlies the professional story. While the world was focused on the soldier, the man was falling apart. He was trying to navigate his grief in a world that only wanted to see the smiling, humble hero. The smile was a mask, and he would wear it for the rest of his life. How did the U.S. Army handle the mental health of a young soldier who had just suffered such a catastrophic personal loss? Did Elvis receive any counseling or support? How much of his later destructive behavior can be traced directly back to his unprocessed grief over his mother's death? If Gladys had lived, would she have been a strong enough voice to stand up to the colonel and protect her son from the Hollywood machine? Number 9, were there secret recordings made in Germany? The official story is that Elvis Presley did not make any professional recordings during his 2 years in the Army. RCA Records released the material he had stockpiled before he left. The next time he stepped into a professional recording studio was in Nashville in March 1960 after his discharge. But Elvis didn't stop being a musician just because he was wearing a uniform. Music was like breathing to him. He had a piano in his house in Bad Nauheim. He had guitars. And according to numerous accounts from the people who were there, he played music constantly. He spent his evenings and weekends singing and playing with his friends. It was his way to relax, to escape the pressures of Army life. This has led to one of the most enduring mysteries of the Army years are their private home recordings from Germany. Did Elvis or someone in his crew have a tape recorder running during these informal jam sessions? The thought is tantalizing. These recordings would be a holy grail for fans. They would capture a completely different Elvis, not the superstar in a state-of-the-art studio, but a young man playing for the pure love of it, with no producers, no engineers, and no pressure. It would be the sound of Elvis unplugged, a decade before that was a concept. There is evidence that such recordings exist. In the 1980s, a handful of tracks surfaced on bootleg albums, claiming to be from the Bad Nauheim house. The sound quality was poor, but the voice was unmistakably Elvis. The songs were a mix of gospel hymns, current pop hits, and old rock and roll numbers. They were loose, informal, and deeply personal. On one track, you can hear him laughing after messing up a lyric. It was a glimpse behind the curtain. Where did these recordings come from? The most likely source is one of the Memphis Mafia members. Someone like Joe Esposito or Lamar Fite could easily have had a small, portable reel-to-reel tape recorder. In his book, Jerry Schilling, another close friend, talks about the constant music in the house. It's almost certain that someone, at some point, hit the record button. RCA Records has officially released some of this material. The 1999 box set, Platinum, A Life in Music, included a few tracks listed as Hum recordings, Bad Nauheim, Germany, 1959. Songs like I'm Beginning to Forget You and Danny Boy, they confirmed what fans had suspected for years. There were tapes. The sound is intimate. You can hear the room. You can hear the piano. It's a raw, emotional performance, completely different from the polished records he was making before and after his army service. This opens up a huge question. How much more is there? Did they just record a few songs on a couple of nights? Or was the tape recorder running often? Are there hours of unreleased material sitting in a box somewhere in the attic of one of his friend's descendants? Are there tapes of him working on new song ideas or just goofing around on rock and roll classics? These recordings, if they exist in any quantity, would be an invaluable historical document. They would bridge the gap between the 50s rebel and the 60s pop star. They would show us his musical mind at work during a time when he was supposedly musically dormant. They would be the true sound of the Los years. The official record shows a 2-year silence. But the rumors and the handful of tracks that have surfaced suggest that in a small house in Germany, the music never stopped. Who made these home recordings, and why were they kept secret for so long? How many tapes were made, and what happened to them after Elvis left Germany? Could a full-length album of these intimate, private performances still be out there, waiting to be discovered? What would these recordings tell us about his state of mind during this tumultuous period of his life? Number 8. Why no live concerts for 8 years? When Elvis Presley left for the Army in 1958, he was the most electrifying live performer on the planet. His concerts were legendary, chaotic events. He fed off the energy of the crowd. It was where he came alive. When he was discharged in 1960, everyone expected him to pick up where he left off. They expected a massive comeback tour. It never happened. After his return, Elvis did not perform a single live concert for more than 8 years. His only live performances were for a handful of charity benefits, most notably a 1961 show in Hawaii. Other than that, for 8 years, the world's greatest live performer did not play for a paying audience. Why? How could this happen? The answer, like most things in Elvis's career, points back to Colonel Tom Parker. The Colonel's business model for the 1960s was based on movies. The plan was simple and lucrative. Make 3 movies a year. Each movie had a soundtrack album. That's 3 movies and 3 albums every year. It was a predictable, controllable, and highly profitable formula. Live touring was the opposite of that. It was unpredictable. It was messy. It required a huge amount of logistics. And in the Colonel's view, it was unnecessary. Why go through the trouble of touring the country when you could make more money by staying in Hollywood? The Colonel believed that live performances would be overexposing his client. If people could see Elvis in person, why would they go to his movies? It was a deeply flawed, short-sighted view, but it was the one he stuck to. Elvis himself seems to have gone along with this plan. At least at first. He had just come out of 2 years of rigid discipline in the Army. The Hollywood lifestyle was easy. The money was incredible. For the film Blue Hawaii, he earned a reported $500,000 plus a percentage of the profits. It was a comfortable life. He made a movie, took a few weeks off, and then made another one. It was a routine. And after the chaos of the 50s and the rigidity of the Army, maybe a comfortable routine was what he wanted. But as the 60s wore on, the quality of the movies and the music declined. The scripts for films like Harem Scarum and Clambake were absurd. The The songs were forgettable, Elvis became deeply unhappy, he was an artist, and he was trapped on an assembly line. He complained to his friends, he knew he was making bad movies, he missed the connection with a live audience. He missed the energy, he missed being a musician. There might also have been a deeper psychological reason. Some have speculated that Elvis developed a form of stage fright, or at least a deep insecurity about performing live. The music world had changed dramatically while he was making movies. The Beatles had arrived. The Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, the whole landscape of popular music was different. Was he still relevant? Could he still compete? After 8 years away from the stage, the thought of coming back must have been terrifying. The last time he had performed, he was the undisputed king. Now, there were a lot of new princes. The 8-year absence from the stage is central to the tragedy of the 60s. It disconnected him from his audience and from the very thing that made him great. He became a celluloid image, a character in a series of silly movies, not a living, breathing musician. The decision to stop touring, made by the Colonel for business reasons, slowly starved his artistic soul. It would take a rebellion, the 1968 comeback special, for him to finally break free and reclaim his crown. Was the decision to stop touring purely a business strategy from the Colonel, or was Elvis himself reluctant to face a live audience again? How much money did they leave on the table by not touring during the height of his movie fame? Did Elvis lose his nerve, or did he simply get too comfortable in the easy world of Hollywood? What did the loss of that live connection do to him, both as an artist and as a man? Number 7, was the amphetamine use a choice or a military necessity? The story of Elvis's tragic death in 1977 is a story of prescription drug abuse. The seeds of that tragedy were sown nearly 2 decades earlier in the cold barracks of West Germany. This is where his lifelong relationship with pills began. The mystery is not whether he started using them there, but why. Was it a simple case of a young man making bad choices, or was it a habit born out of the specific pressures and necessities of his military service? The official introduction to amphetamines was practical and seemingly innocent. During late-night training maneuvers, soldiers needed to stay awake and alert for long periods. A German sergeant reportedly offered Elvis and some of his friends a little white pill that would do the trick. At the time, amphetamines like Benzodrine were widely used and not heavily stigmatized. The military itself often distributed them to soldiers to enhance performance and endurance. From this perspective, Elvis's initial use was not recreational. It was a tool, a part of the job of being a soldier. The problem was what happened next. The drug didn't just keep him awake, it made him feel good. It gave him energy, it created a sense of euphoria, and in the boring, disciplined world of army life, that feeling was addictive. He and his friends started using the pills not just on maneuvers, but back at their house in Bad Nauheim. They used them to stay up all night, talking, listening to music, and having parties. Then came the other side of the coin. After being up for days on amphetamines, you can't just fall asleep naturally. So they were introduced to another kind of pill downers, barbiturates or sleeping pills to force their bodies to shut down. This started the deadly cycle of uppers and downers that would define the rest of his life. A pill to get you going, and a pill to make you stop. His personal circumstances made him particularly vulnerable. He was grieving the recent death of his mother, he was lonely and isolated, thousands of miles from home. The pills offered a chemical escape from his pain. They could numb the grief. They could create a false sense of well-being. It's easy to see how a young man in his situation could become dependent on them. The culture around him didn't help. The other guys in his entourage, the Memphis Mafia, were using them too. It became a group activity, a shared secret. There was no one there to tell him it was a bad idea. No one to warn him of the long-term dangers. In the bubble of his private world, it just became the new normal. So, was it a choice? Yes, in the sense that no one forced him to take the pills after those first few times. But was it a free choice? That's more complicated. When you combine the pressures of military life, the availability of the drugs, the deep personal grief he was experiencing, and the lack of any negative feedback from those around him, it looks less like a simple choice and more like a perfect storm of circumstances. The army didn't make him a drug addict, but it created the exact conditions in which his addiction could take root and grow. He brought the habit home with him from Germany, and it never left. Did Elvis understand the danger of the pills when he started taking them, or did he see them as harmless tools provided by the army? How much did his superior officers know about the drug use among the soldiers, and did they turn a blind eye? Could his lifelong addiction have been prevented if he had received proper grief counseling after his mother's death? Was this the Army's darkest secret? Not a conspiracy, but a culture that inadvertently fostered a deadly dependency in its most famous soldier? Number 6. Who was the real target of the haters? The man or the music? Before he was drafted, Elvis Presley was one of the most controversial figures in America. The criticism was relentless. Ministers called his music the devil's music. Parent groups said his performances were obscene. Segregationists were furious that a white man was singing black music and becoming a hero to white teenagers. He was accused of corrupting the youth of America. The hate was intense. Then he went into the Army. And almost overnight, the criticism stopped. The man who had been a public enemy was suddenly a national hero. The same newspapers that had condemned him were now praising his patriotism. It was a stunning reversal. This raises a fundamental question: what were people really angry about in the first place? Was it Elvis the man, with his sneer and his swiveling hips? Or was it the rock and roll music he represented? The Army years provide the answer. When Elvis put on the uniform, he symbolically surrendered. He cut his hair, he stopped dancing, he stopped singing rock and roll, he became a good boy. He submitted to the authority of the U.S. government. By doing this, he neutralized the threat. He showed the establishment that he could be controlled. He was no longer a rebel. He was a soldier. This suggests that the primary target of the hate was not the man himself, but what he represented: a cultural rebellion. Rock and roll was a new, dangerous force in the 1950s. It was loud, it was sexual, and most threateningly, it was a fusion of white country music and black rhythm and blues. It was breaking down racial barriers at a time when segregation was the law of the land. Elvis was the lightning rod for all the anxieties that this cultural shift produced. He was the face of the rebellion, so he was the one who got the blame. When he went into the Army, the rebellion was put on hold. And when he came back, the rebellion was over, his music was softer, his image was cleaner, he made family-friendly movies, he was no longer a threat, and the critics fell silent. They had won, they had successfully tamed rock and roll's biggest star. The Colonel understood this perfectly. His decision to have Elvis serve as a regular soldier and not in special services was a calculated move to appease the critics. It was a public act of submission. The Colonel sacrificed the art to save the business. He knew that for Elvis to have a long-term career, he had to be accepted by the mainstream, by the parents who had hated him. The Army was the perfect tool to achieve that. This period reveals the deep cultural hypocrisy of the 1950s. The same society that celebrated his patriotism in 1958 had condemned his art in 1957. It shows that the fear was never really about a gyrating pelvis. It was about a fundamental change in American culture, a change that Elvis Presley was at the forefront of. The Army years were a forced truce in that culture war. And when the truce was over, the battlefield had changed. The rebellion had moved on, and Elvis was left behind a safe and sanitized icon. Did the establishment, the government, the media, the cultural conservatives consciously use the draft as a way to neutralize the threat of rock and roll? Was the public's sudden acceptance of Elvis a genuine change of heart, or was it a celebration of the fact that the rebel had been brought to heel? You know, if Elvis had refused the draft, would his career have been completely destroyed? Did America love the soldier, but still hate the music? Number 5, how much money was really being made, and where did it go? Elvis Presley was a money-making machine. Even while he was in the Army, away from the public eye, the money kept rolling in. Record sales were strong, merchandising was booming, but the real money, the foundation of his wealth for the next decade, came from the movie deals the Colonel was negotiating. The numbers are staggering. For his first post-Army film, GI Blues, he received a salary of $200,000 and 50% of the profits. The film was a huge box office success. The soundtrack album sold over 1 million copies. The money was pouring in from all directions. Throughout the 1960s, this pattern continued. He was one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood, regularly commanding $1 million per film plus a share of the profits. With 3 movies a year, plus the accompanying soundtrack albums, his annual income was astronomical. On paper, he should have been one of the wealthiest people in the entertainment industry. But there's a huge mystery at the heart of Elvis's finances. Where did all that money go? When he died in 1977, his estate was worth a surprisingly modest amount, estimated at around $5 million. For a man who had earned hundreds of millions of dollars over his career, this number seems impossibly low. This raises serious questions about how his financial empire was managed, or mismanaged, during the Lost years and beyond. The first and most obvious answer is Colonel Tom Parker. The Colonel's management contract was legendary for being one of the most lucrative in history. Initially, he took a 25% commission. That was already high, but over the years, that percentage crept up. By the 1970s, the Colonel was taking 50% of everything Elvis earned. A 50-50 split between an artist and a manager is almost unheard of. The Colonel wasn't just his manager, he was his business partner, and he was taking half of the gross income before taxes and expenses. Then there were the expenses. Elvis had an incredible overhead. He had to pay for Graceland. He had to pay the salaries of his father, Vernon, who managed his personal finances, and the entire Memphis Mafia. He was famously generous, buying cars and houses for friends, family, and sometimes complete strangers. His spending habits were lavish and uncontrolled. There were also questionable business deals. The Colonel, for example, sold Elvis's entire back catalog of recordings to RCA in 1973 for a lump sum of just over $5 million. This was a short-sighted deal that traded long-term royalty income for a quick cash payout. It was a terrible financial decision, but it generated a large commission for the Colonel. The financial structures put in place during the Army years, when the Colonel had total control, set the stage for this lifelong pattern of high earnings and even higher spending. The focus was always on generating immediate cash flow through movies and soundtracks rather than on long-term wealth management or artistic development. The business was run like a carnival: get the money while you can and don't worry about tomorrow. When you look at the numbers, it's clear that while Elvis was serving his country, the Colonel was building a financial system that benefited himself as much, if not more, than it benefited Elvis. The king earned a fortune, but he was surrounded by people, his manager, his father, his friends, who were all on his payroll. He was the source of all the wealth, but he seemed to have the least control over it. Was Colonel Parker's 50% commission a fair price for his management, or was it a case of financial exploitation? How much did Elvis's own extravagant spending contribute to his financial problems? Did his father, Vernon, have the financial expertise to manage such a vast fortune, or was he in over his head? Could Elvis have been one of the wealthiest entertainers in history if his career had been managed differently? Number 4. What was the real story behind his martial arts obsession? While Elvis was in Germany, he was introduced to something that would become a lifelong passion and a central part of his identity: karate. He began training in the Shotokan style under a German instructor. When he returned to the U.S., he continued his training with relentless dedication, eventually earning a black belt. For the rest of his life, martial arts were more than just a hobby. They were a philosophy, a discipline, and a key part of his stage performance. Why did karate take such a powerful hold on him during this specific time? On the surface, it was a way to stay in shape and pass the time. Army life involved a lot of physical training, and karate was a natural extension of that. It was also a way for him and his friends, like Red West, to bond. They trained together constantly. But the obsession ran deeper. For a man whose life was completely controlled by others, first the Army, then the Colonel, karate offered a sense of personal power and control. And it was a discipline that he mastered himself. It was something he earned, not something that was given to him because he was famous. In the dojo, he wasn't Elvis Presley, the superstar. He was just another student learning the forms, striving for perfection. It gave him a sense of self-worth that was separate from his fame. The philosophy behind martial arts also appealed to him. It was about more than just fighting. It was about discipline, focus, and a spiritual connection between mind and body. This resonated deeply with Elvis, who was beginning a lifelong spiritual search. He was always looking for answers, for a deeper meaning to his life. Martial arts provided a framework, a code to live by. He would later study under masters like Ed Parker and Kang Rhee, delving deeper into the spiritual and philosophical aspects of the practice. This new passion had a direct and visible impact on his career. When he finally returned to the stage in the late 1960s and 1970s, his performances were completely different. The old rebellious hip swiveling was gone. It was replaced by a new, powerful stage presence heavily influenced by karate. The dramatic lunges, the high kicks, the chopping hand gestures, these all came directly from his martial arts training. It became a key part of his new image. The famous jumpsuits he wore in the 70s were even designed to allow him the freedom of movement for his karate-inspired moves. The obsession began in Germany, a place and time where he was feeling particularly powerless. He had lost his mother, he had lost his freedom, he was a cog in a military machine. The karate gave him a way to build himself back up, to find a center of control in a life that was spinning out of it. It was a constructive response to the trauma and dislocation of the army years. It was a way to channel his aggression and his energy. While the pills were a way to escape, karate was a way to engage, to build, to become stronger. It was one of the few positive things he took with him from his time away. Was Elvis's dedication to karate a healthy form of discipline, or was it another obsession, like the women and the drugs, that he used to fill the void in his life? How did his bodyguards and entourage, many of whom were also martial artists, use their skills to protect him or to intimidate others? Did the aggressive, almost violent stage moves of his later years reflect a man in control or a man struggling with inner demons? Could his interest in the spiritual side of martial arts have saved him if he had pursued it more deeply? Number 3, was Colonel Parker secretly afraid of leaving the United States? This is one of the biggest and most consequential mysteries of Elvis's entire career, and it directly relates to the Army years. Colonel Tom Parker, the man who controlled every aspect of Elvis's life, never left the United States. Not once. In the 1960s, Elvis was a global superstar. He received massive offers to tour Europe, Japan, Australia. He could have sold out any stadium in the world. He never played a single concert outside of North America. A few shows in Canada in 1957 were the only exception. Why? The official reason given by the colonel was always practical. He claimed the venues weren't big enough. The security costs were too high. The logistics were too complicated. He argued that they could make more money more easily by staying in the US, first with the movies and later with the long-term engagements in Las Vegas. But almost everyone who has studied Elvis's career, including his closest friends and most serious biographers, believes the real reason was much more personal and much more damning. The colonel couldn't leave the country because he was an illegal immigrant. He didn't have a passport, and he was terrified of applying for one. As mentioned earlier, his real name was Andreas Cornelis van Kuijk, and he was from the Netherlands. He had entered the U.S. illegally in the 1920s. He had served in the U.S. Army himself, but had reportedly deserted. His past was a house of cards, and he lived in constant fear of it collapsing. Passport application would have required a birth certificate and other documents he didn't have. It would have triggered a background check that could have exposed his entire life as a lie. He could have faced deportation. This single, selfish secret had a devastating impact on Elvis's career. It's the most likely reason he turned down the Special Services tour when Elvis was in the Army. He couldn't go with him. It's the reason Elvis never became a true global touring artist like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. The world wanted to see him, but his manager's personal secret kept him trapped in America. Imagine what could have been. A tour of Europe in the mid-60s could have re-energized him. It could have exposed him to new music, new influences. It could have broken him out of the Hollywood rut. It could have reminded him that he was an international cultural phenomenon, not just a B-movie actor. The colonel's fear of a passport application arguably cost Elvis the second half of his career. The irony is staggering. Elvis, the all-American boy, served his country overseas. His manager, the man who waved the flag and promoted Elvis's patriotism, was not even an American citizen and was possibly a deserter. The entire narrative of the Army years, so carefully managed by the colonel, was built on a foundation of personal hypocrisy. The man who wrapped Elvis in the American flag was terrified of the American immigration system. This secret explains so many of the strange, self-destructive business decisions that defined Elvis's career. It wasn't about what was best for Elvis, it was about what was safe for the colonel. How did the colonel manage to hide his true identity for so many decades, even from his most famous client? Did Elvis ever suspect the truth about his manager's past? If the truth had come out, would Elvis have fired him, or would he have stood by him? How much bigger could the Elvis Presley phenomenon have become if it had been allowed to go global? Number 2. Did the U.S. government deliberately target him? This is a question that ventures into the realm of conspiracy theory, but it's one that has lingered for decades. Was it just bad luck that the biggest star in the world got his draft notice at the absolute peak of his fame? Or was there something more deliberate at play? Was the US government trying to silence him? The context of the times is important. The late 1950s was the height of the Cold War. It was a time of social conformity and fear of subversion. Elvis Presley was anything but a conformist. He was a cultural disruptor. As we've discussed, his music and his performance style were seen as a direct threat to the established social order. He was encouraging teenagers to rebel. He was popularizing black music. From the perspective of the conservative establishment, he was a dangerous influence. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was known for keeping files on public figures they considered subversive. And they did have a file on Elvis Presley. It was filled with letters from concerned citizens decrying him as a menace to society. Hoover's FBI was obsessed with rooting out influences that they believed were undermining American values. Could they have seen Elvis as one of those influences? The theory goes like this: the draft was a convenient and powerful tool. What better way to neutralize a rebellious figure than to draft him into the most disciplined conformist organization in the country of the U.S. Army? It would get him out of the public eye for 2 years. It would interrupt the momentum of his career. And it would force him to submit to authority. It was a perfect, publicly acceptable way to defang the king of rock and roll. There is no smoking gun document that proves this theory. There's no memo from the White House or the FBI saying, let's draft Elvis. The official story is that he was just one of thousands of young men whose number came up. His local Memphis draft board treated him like any other citizen. However, the circumstances are suspicious. The timing was almost too perfect, and the outcome was exactly what the establishment would have wanted. The rebellious Elvis went in, and the patriotic, clean-cut Elvis came out. The problem was solved. Whether it was a deliberate plot or a fortunate coincidence for his critics, the effect was the same. The draft served as a powerful tool of social control. It sent a clear message to other would-be rebels: get too far out of line, and the system can reel you back in. The story of Elvis and the draft became a cautionary tale. This theory adds another layer of tragedy to the Lost Years. It suggests that Elvis wasn't just a victim of bad timing or his manager's greed. He may have been a casualty of the culture wars, a political target whose art was deemed too dangerous to be left unchecked. He was drafted not just to be a soldier, but to be an example. Is there any credible evidence to support the idea of a government conspiracy to draft Elvis, or is it just a compelling theory? How much was J. Edgar Hoover personally interested in or concerned about the rise of Elvis Presley? If the draft was a deliberate act, who would have had to authorize it? And does it matter if it was a conspiracy or not, if the end result, the taming of a cultural rebel, was the same? Number 1, what if he had said no? This is the ultimate unsolved mystery, the great what if that hangs over Elvis Presley's entire life and career. What if, in 1958, he had refused to be drafted? What if he had said no? It was an option. He was a wealthy and famous man. He could have challenged the draft. He could have declared himself a conscientious objector, though on what grounds is unclear. He could have fled the country, becoming an exile like Muhammad Ali would a decade later for refusing to draft during the Vietnam War. He had the means to fight it. The pressure to serve was immense. The colonel, for his own reasons, was adamant that he should go. His country was calling. Refusing the draft in the 1950s, during the Cold War, was seen as an act of treason. The public backlash would have been enormous. He would have gone from being a controversial hero to an outright villain overnight. He likely would have faced prison time. The government would have made an example of him. His career, as he knew it, would have been over. But what would have been born in its place? Imagine an Elvis Presley who became a symbol of anti-authoritarianism, an artist who sacrificed his career for his principles. He would have lost his mainstream audience, but he might have gained a new, more radical one. He could have become a voice for the counterculture that was just beginning to stir. Instead of becoming a safe Hollywood entertainer, he could have become a folk hero, a rebel with a cause. His music would have changed dramatically. He couldn't have recorded for a major label like RCA while he was a fugitive or in prison. He might have been forced into a more acoustic, stripped-down sound. He might have started writing his own songs about his experiences, about injustice. He could have become a very different and perhaps more authentic kind of artist. Of course, this is all speculation. The Elvis we know was a patriot. He was a good son who respected authority. The thought of refusing the draft probably never seriously crossed his mind. He did what was expected of him. He was a good soldier, but the decision to say yes, set him on a path that led to Germany, to the pills, to the death of his mother in isolation, to the long-term movie contracts, to the creative stagnation of the 60s, and to the slow sequin decline in Las Vegas. The decision to serve his country may have ultimately destroyed him as an artist and as a man. The safe path turned out to be the most dangerous one of all. The 2 years he was lost in the army were the years his future was decided for him. By saying yes, he handed control of his life and his art over to others. He never truly got it back. The ultimate mystery is not what happened in Germany. It's what would have happened if he had never gone. What was the exact conversation between Elvis and the Colonel when they decided he should accept the draft? Did Elvis ever express any doubts or fears about his decision? Who would he have become, as a musician and a man, if he had chosen the path of defiance? And the most haunting question of all, did he spend the rest of his life wondering if he had made a mistake?